Baik, selamat sore teman-teman. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera untuk teman-teman semua. Selamat datang kembali di seri pop-up discussion dari Resilience Development Initiative, kelompok penelitian pengungsi perkotaan RDI UREF. Saya Akino Tahir, host Anda hari ini. Good afternoon everyone, welcome to our pop-up discussion series organized by Resilience Development Initiative, Urban Refugee Research Group RDI UREF. I am Akino Tahir, your host for today. First of all, I would like to welcome Ms. Fumiko Okamoto and Maho Nakayama from Sasakawa Peace Foundation, as well as all our speakers and international audience. Saya juga ingin menyambut teman-teman yang sudah hadir di sini, baik melalui Zoom ataupun melalui YouTube. Namun dengan mayoritas panelis kita adalah pembicara internasional, maka sesi hari ini akan berlangsung dalam bahasa Inggris. Bagi Anda yang butuh terjemahan dan bergabung melalui Zoom, silahkan cari fitur berjudul Interpretation di sebelah bawah kanan layar Anda. Tapi karena pilihan bahasa Indonesia tidak selalu ada di semua perangkat elektronik, maka teman-teman bisa pilih channel Korean atau bahasa Korea untuk mendengarkan bahasa Indonesia. Memang instruksinya agak sedikit membingungkan ya, tapi jangan cemas. Dengan memilih channel Korea, teman-teman bisa mendengarkan penerjemah yang memakai bahasa Indonesia. Namun fitur ini hanya tersedia untuk teman-teman yang bergabung melalui Zoom, dan saya mohon maaf untuk teman-teman yang menggunakan YouTube, karena fitur ini belum tersedia di sana. Today our pop-up discussion series is special because all our previous discussions were in Bahasa Indonesia as they were intended for Indonesian audience. Today, in the 6th installment of the series, we will discuss about urban refugee governance in ASEAN countries in a moderated panel discussion format. Most of the speakers are international speakers, and that's why the session today will be moderated in English. We do have live interpretation feature at Zoom for our Indonesian audience. Sekali lagi, teman-teman yang membutuhkan, silahkan mengaktifkan fitur interpretation dan pilih channel Korea untuk mendengarkan terjemahan dalam bahasa Indonesia. Selanjutnya, saya akan meneruskan sesi ini dalam bahasa Inggris, jadi teman-teman yang membutuhkan, silahkan fiturnya diaktifkan dari sekarang. Now I want to introduce our research group, RDI UREF. Our research group is focusing on urban refugee issues from interdisciplinary perspective, mainly combining the field of social science, international relations, migration, and urban planning and development. We want to see how cities affected by forced migration deal with the refugee issue despite the limited regulation and framework at the national level. We hope the research can be a good basis to support governments to develop better policies and practices at the local level. Through our pop-up discussion series, we hope to introduce this issue to the wider public so more people can understand about it and be inspired to be involved in the solution in their own way. We have been doing the series every 2 weeks since August, and the series will be running until November. You can check out our previous discussion at YouTube channel RDI Indonesia, although the discussion are only available in Bahasa Indonesia. Now, this year, our research is focusing on stakeholder mapping for urban refugee management in Indonesia, but it is of course related to the discussion at the regional level, meaning in Southeast Asia and Pacific. And that's why we think it's necessary to discuss about the topic for today. A little bit of housekeeping for today. First of all, participants, all of you can post questions and comments at the Q&A feature at Zoom or chat section at YouTube. Fill out the attendance list and feedback form. The links are also provided through chat at Zoom and YouTube. And last, our discussion summary and any questions and comments not yet answered will be posted at our social media, so do follow us. Teman-teman yang menggunakan fitur terjemahan dengan memilih channel Korea itu bisa mute original audio supaya suaranya tidak double ya antara suara penerjemah dengan suara asli. Jadi kalau misalnya ingin hanya mendengarkan bahasa Indonesia, itu ada pilihan untuk mute original audio, bisa dipilih supaya ada tanda tiknya. Jadi cuma bisa mendengarkan suara penerjemah saja. Alright. Before we start, let me introduce the moderator for today. Our moderator is from RDI UREF, Dr. Nino Viartasiwi. Dr. Nino is a senior researcher at our team. She received her PhD in International Relations from Ritsumeikan University in Japan. Her research focuses on conflict and transnationalism studies, And this year, Dr. Nino is leading our research on urban refugee management and stakeholder mapping in Indonesia. Mbak Nino, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Akino, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm Nino Viartasiwi from the Resilience Development Initiative Urban Refugee Research Group, your moderator for today's pop-up discussion. As Akino has mentioned, this is the 6th installment of our pop-up discussion, out of 8 series. And in the previous 5 series, we had discussed urban refugee issue in Indonesia from the introduction level to mapping the actors. And if this is your first time joining the RDI Urban Refugees pop-up discussion, you can check the recording of our previous sessions at RDI Indonesia's YouTube channel. But please be reminded that all the last session were in Bahasa Indonesia, And today we are moving on to expand our knowledge beyond the country's border. We will talk about urban refugees governance in 3 Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, as well as discuss the common challenges that the 3 countries are experiencing and the way forward. We are having with us this afternoon leading experts on urban refugees. We have Ying Tham from Asylum Access Malaysia. We have Katchada, Prommachan or Muai from Host International Thailand. We have Ziko Pestalozzi from SUAKA Indonesia. And we have Antje Missbach from Freiburg University. Today we will divide the discussion into 3 sessions. First, we will discuss urban refugee governance in Thailand and Malaysia. And also, during this discussion, if you have questions or comments for the speaker, you can use the Q&A column and type your question or opinion. For participants at YouTube, please type it at the chat. We will help you to move it to Zoom. And then I will refer the question to speaker for responses. For participants who need translation for Bahasa Indonesia, we already provide a translation service. All you need to do is click on the word Korean on the translation button, and you will hear the translation in Bahasa Indonesia. Okay, after the first session dedicated to learning about Malaysia and Thailand's urban refugees issue, we will have a second session to learn about Indonesia and urban refugees regional issue, followed by another round of Q&A. And lastly, we will hold a third session that brings together the 4 speakers to discuss the similarities and common threads of various approaches to urban refugees governance in 3 countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. We will also discuss how we can move forward towards a better coordinated regional arrangement on urban refugees governance. And this session will also be followed by a Q&A session from the audience. All right, let's start the first session. Let me introduce our speakers for the first session. Okay, we have a first speaker is Ying Tham from Asylum Access Malaysia. Ying has over 9 years experience as human rights practitioners in legal and right-based advocacy. She is currently the executive director of Asylum Access Malaysia. She was a practicing litigator on issues affecting gender equality and child rights. She previously served as president of the Association of Human Lawyers Malaysia and is the former deputy chair of the Asia Pacific Refugees Rights Networks, or APPRN, Southeast Asia Working Group. Ying has a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Reading and a master's degree in Human Rights from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And speaker number 2 is Katchada Prommachan, or Muai. She is a Thailand country manager in Host International. She focuses to oversee program implementation, ensure delivery of quality case management, and lead of regional coordination, government and stakeholder engagement, and capacity building and advocacy activities. Muai has over 12 years experience in child protection, including at Plan International Thailand, Save the Children International, and the International Rescue Committee. Okay, let's just say hello first to Muai and Ying. Hello.
Hi. Hi. Lovely to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Hello. And how are you today?
Good. Exciting for this
Ah.
session. Both excited and nervous.
Yeah.
Will not lie. I will not lie.
First of all, of course, thank you for joining us all this afternoon. And also, this is actually a rare chance to have a forum like this. And I'm personally looking forward to learning from the two of you. And I will start the discussion with one question for Ying first, yeah? Ying, we need this question first. This is very basic question, but this question is to have a better understanding of our discussion. We need to set a base actually of the definition of the term urban refugees. So my first question will be, what is your definition of urban refugees? This is to set the basic.
Sure. So for our definition, it's basically refugees who are not in a camp, so not in an encampment situation, but it's rather sort of outside of that sort of context.
Oh, okay. So let me clarify. This is your understanding, my take, yeah. Your understanding on urban refugees is highlighting on the treatment that refugees in Malaysia receive from the authorities and not on the geographical aspect that refugees are living.
So it's more kind of like what context are they living in? So for example, in Malaysia, all of them are urban refugees because we do not have refugee camps. So that's how we make the sort of distinction. So in Malaysia, for example, they are like largely sort of in like across sort of all different parts of Malaysia. So they're not just limited to like one particular area and within what we call a refugee camp.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you. So moving on to the next question. I will ask the same question actually to Muay.
Yes.
To set the Ying, what is the current situation regarding urban refugee governance in Malaysia? Maybe the statistic, demographic, the length of waiting period. Those information are still maybe new for most of our participants in this session.
Yeah. Sure. So in terms of statistics, as of the end of August 2020, there are about 180,000 refugees and asylum seekers that are registered with UNHCR in Malaysia. So as for those who are not registered, we don't have like an actual figure. So the majority of refugees and asylum seekers in Malaysia are from Myanmar, mostly Rohingya, and then we've got like the Burmese ethnic groups. Other sort of demographics, we have Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia, Iraq. So quite a mixture. In terms of our geographical distribution, so we're talking about Peninsular Malaysia. So most of them are in sort of Kuala Lumpur and Selangor, which are like the central states in Peninsular Malaysia. And then it's followed by the northmost state, Kedah, and the southmost state, Johor. So those are where most of the refugees are currently.
Okay. Are they being moved or being located in that locations, or it's like individual choice to live in those areas in Malaysia?
A lot of it is individual choice. So I think like we have a large numbers in KL and Selangor because that's our main sort of main states, right? Some of the central cities. Kedah, because it's sort of we're by the coast, so most boat arrivals actually land in Kedah. But like by and large, it's sort of by choice. Sort of movement, as in there's no sort of restriction in terms of which states they can be in.
Oh, there's no restriction to live in any place in Malaysia from the government?
No.
Okay.
No strictly.
What is the kind of support that the government of Malaysia give for those refugees in Malaysia and asylum seekers?
So in a nutshell, I mean the short answer is there isn't a lot of support. So Malaysia is not a signatory to the 1951 convention, and we don't have any legislative or administrative framework for refugee protection or identification. So UNHCR is the only body that makes a determination of refugees and asylum seekers and their status. And so there isn't anything formally that the government provides in terms of support for refugees and asylum seekers. But Malaysia does kind of, we have done, the Malaysian government has kind of provided certain groups of refugees in the past, some level of, some status, the right to stay, and like some of them, to some extent, the right to work. But all of it has been very ad hoc. And it's only for very certain groups, limited numbers. So one example, which cited in the paper, introduction paper, is the Rohingya. So there was a pilot project for a small group of Rohingya refugees to work in the plantation sector and the manufacturing sector. But formally, there isn't any sort of framework or policy governing refugees, and consequently, governing any kind of support for refugees and asylum seekers while they're in Malaysia.
Oh, but they are allowed to work?
No.
No?
So, no, because refugees in Malaysia are not recognized. So under the Immigration Act, they're actually considered illegal immigrants. Which means that they are technically, so the fact that they're even in the country means that, like, if they are found, they can be arrested and detained. But the difference is that because UNHCR makes this determination, the government has there is this sort of policy, unwritten policy, that those with UNHCR documentation may not, like, won't be arrested or detained. But again, implementation hasn't been consistent, and the policy is an unwritten one. So, we have also come across cases where those who are documented have been nevertheless arrested and detained.
Oh, I see. So Malaysia is also one destination for illegal migrants. Also economic migrants. How to differentiate? The government. How the government differentiate between those under UNHCR and also those illegal migrants or economic migrants in Malaysia?
So in Malaysia, so it's UNHCR that makes the determination. So it really is based on UNHCR documentation and the UNHCR's sort of database. So the government would have to kind of communicate to kind of make a determination about the status. Where it is a bit tricky is where they are unregistered, because the process of registering and also the process of the refugee status determination process is a long one. And so frequently we do have sort of like refugees who are seeking asylum, but because there isn't a framework, they are nevertheless sort of arrested and detained. But the government does, there are certain authorities who will actually contact the UNHCR and actually ask them to sort of make a determination about whether or not this person does have a status. But by and large, it's sort of a communication between the government authorities with UNHCR.
Oh, okay. So it's ad hoc based, like whenever there's case coming, so it's like they communicate case by case. Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I see. Okay. So I will turn to Muay first. Muay, the same question. What is the definition of urban refugees according to Host International Thailand, probably?
Yeah, I think the definitions of the urban refugee in Thailand, I think that I have the same answer with Hui, that the refugee who are not stay in the campsite, the refugee camp, because normally in Thailand, most people know that we have the resettlement camps, nine resettlement camps along the Thai-Myanmar border. But most of them who are living in that camp, that's majority of them that Burmese or current people that who are living in that facility under the Ministry of Interior. But for the urban refugee, that means the person who are not living in the camp, but mostly stay in the urban area. So but the definitions of the urban refugee, the same definitions of the camp refugee, that the people who are fleeing from their home country because of maybe armed conflict or any kind of prosecution as that cannot make them stay at their own country, and they flee to seeking for asylum in Thailand. That for the urban refugee in Thailand, most of them they target to traveling to Bangkok first because they can contact to UNHCR in Bangkok to seeking for asylum and register for RSD refugee status determination process in Bangkok. For the urban refugee that in Thailand, majority of them from many countries, that's including Pakistan, Palestine, Syrians, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka. We also do have the population from our neighboring countries such as Laos, Vietnamese, and Cambodia. And also we do have the Rohingya people that were coming from the southern deep south of Thailand. That's most of them living around Bangkok and the greater Bangkok area, and also most of Rohingya, most of them living in the deep southern of Thailand. Yeah.
Oh, deep southern of Thailand. Oh,
yes.
So for those who live in the deep southern of Thailand, how they can access UNHCR services?
I think it depends, because some people who if they would like to claim as they are Rohingya, that's automatically they recognize as a refugee. That's different from other. They have to go to the UNHCR process. If when they entry and have to contact with the police or any like Thai governments, if they claim themselves as a Rohingya, it's automatic to go to that process. But it still depends, because some person might don't want to claim them as a Rohingya people, that will go to another channel.
Oh, I see. So for them, Rohingya automatically will be put in the refugees categories.
Yes.
How about other refugees from other like ethnicities, Burmese in Burmese?
In Burmese, that I think in Burmese normally that we do concern that they have to go process that's living in the camps. That's quite separate from other urban refugee, because we know we have the camp refugee site. It means that person who you flee from any conflicts, any prostitution from Myanmar. Normally those people, they have to come from the come through the national border along the Thai-Myanmar border and go to that process. And UNHCR have facility, have many organizations work there to ensure that they engage to RSD process. But different, but that for Myanmar, because they have specific location to identify and provide the process for those people to claim as a refugee. But it's a bit different from other nationality who are not Myanmar, that they have to go to Bangkok.
Yeah. So other than Myanmar, there are no refugees living outside Bangkok and the Bangkok greater area.
Yeah, I can say may do have, because normally because from my experience, I used to work in Messot, so that's for some living condition that the person who live in the camp refugee, they have to ask for permission to go out from the camp to seeking for some work, or that's many things, that to go to the hospital or any kind of thing, that they still have condition that have to deal with the MOI. They have a regulation for them to follow. But I can say may do have people in Bangkok or not, but it's maybe out of record, because every record will be processed for within the camp refugee.
How many are those? How many are they refugees in Thailand? Malaysia has quite a lot of number, 180,000. Indonesia only have 14,000.
I think I never have the exact number for the camp refugee site. It's quite a lot number. That's more than around, that's more than 100,000. That for the camp refugee site. and for but camp refugee side that most of them who are concerned as a refugee, this mean that they are got the UNHCR provide the card for them, right? That we call as the refugee in campsite. It's very clear definition and know who it is. But for the urban refugee, that's the definition that we are term and work with them. We are understand that part of the refugee who are recognized by UNHCR, that we have a number that estimates around 5,000 in Bangkok and Greater Bangkok area, but out of that who are not registered or that got refilled from UNHCR, but they still cannot go back home yet. But for hosts that we are still concerned as they are so the refugee, that because they might have some they still have some condition, some concern that make them to go back home, just cannot pass the UNHCR process. But for us, we still do concern as we can call them as an urban refugee. That is more number, but we never do any like survey on how many population in Bangkok.
So even UNHCR, they don't have that kind of number?
Yeah, the concern is not UNHCR, people of concern by UNHCR, that we are called non people of concern, that have a lot of people.
I see. So what is the support that those urban refugees receive from the government or from the other bodies, international bodies?
I think Thailand we have almost the same situations in Malaysia, that Thailand also is not signatory in refugee conventions, so it do not recognize refugee rights. And in domestic law, we also concern those urban refugees who are even got UNHCR cards, and we are considered as an illegal migration for the country. That means those people who don't have right to work, don't have the right to access to any kind of service in the country. This means I can say that in the past, maybe officially government will not provide any support because concerned that people who are immigrants, that when the police found all of them that found by police have to be arrested and detained in the immigration. But however, nowadays, since early of last year, Thailand, we developed one of the memorandum of understandings on the determinations of the measure and approach alternative to detentions of the children in immigration detention center. That is kind of maybe I can say this kind of one of support or service from the government to concern the children and their family who are detained in the detentions, that the urban refugee children and family also include in that MOU, that includes one of beneficiary that would like to ensure that the children and their family will not detain during when they arrest, and they can release from the detention with the bail and have the condition to be reported every 15 days. That is one kind of service that Thailand start to consider and provide some protections. Maybe we can start from the children that more consider on the protections, and also the latest legislation that Thailand step up from the MOU, that we do have the regulations of the Office of Prime Minister on the screening of aliens who are entering into the kingdom. That's what we call in shortly that the NSM, National Screening Mechanism. That is one of service. I say that the service that's in the past, normally when the people seeking for asylum and would like to apply for the ISD process, they have to go to UNHCR, and UNHCR have their own staff and process to run through and ensure that which people who can claim as a refugee. But after this regulation launch, all implementation will shift from UNHCR to the Immigration Bureau. But actually we launched on the regulations already, but the implementation but not yet starts. Because it's during, I think, regarding to COVID pandemic situation, so and have to be ensure every thing have to set, have to have sets, and would like to the government also still develop on the the process to implement the NSM. Yeah, that is the new, very new approach for Thailand.
What is the difference from the previous approach? Like, what is the benefit, the better point?
I think it's not difficult to say how it's different, because the NSM by the Thai government not yet start to implement yet, because somehow the new coming have to go to Indonesia while we are waiting for the process from the government, from the immigrations. I think I cannot say how it's benefits or positive or negative, but it's the thing that we are concerned, because normally when people flee from their original country to seeking for asylum with Indonesia, it make people feel that it's easy to access. Once they got rejected from Indonesia, they just go back to the place that they live in Bangkok. Nothing to be concerned. But in the future, if people flee from their own country seeking for asylum, they have to go to the immigrations. But all know that immigration as a one-off police agency. This means make people more, that's reluctant to go. That's what happened if once they submit the application, any process during they are waiting, they have to go to detentions or can go back to the home. And what happened if they got rejected by the government? They have to, go to immigration or not, have to be detained. That's a lot of questions come up, not just from the refugee, and also as a CSO network, we are so concerned and would like to know what's kind of the procedure that government would like to implement, and we are also waiting to see the SOP.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So this is very new. So how about the current situation? If they got rejected, they just go back home, and but without how long they will be staying in Thailand usually?
You mean before resettlement? Difficult now. I think once people apply for the ISD process, if first that Indonesia are rejected, they can appeal, right? That have to each people can request for the legal assistance. That Indonesia have two organizations work closely with Indonesia, that's who are AAT, that Asylum Access Thailand provide the legal consultations, and CAP Center for Asylum Protection, that they provide the legal assistance for those people who need any kind of assistance while they are claim and submit anything to UNHCR, that they can reopen. Even they rejected, they can ask for support from the lawyer to reopen the case, but the lawyer will help them to collect more new evidence and ensure that evidence can valuable enough for UNHCR to reconsider. That is the process. But for the person who already received the refugee status, that's for the timeline to ensure that they can resettlement. I think recently it's difficult to estimate the time, because I think we all know that nowadays the country who are resettlement country, they have a limited number who receive and coming, and also the refugee people is increasing number, is quite that is not aligned each other. Have it seem to be the time frame of people who before resettlement is waiting for a long time, because I see some case waiting for more than 10 years, but some waiting for maybe 3 years. It depends. I think it depends on how vulnerable of that people as well. Because if the case, the POC, UNHCR found that each POC have very most vulnerable, it will be put as a priority for them to consider for resettlement. That is have many kind of situations. And for the people who are rejected, okay, they, as Thailand, we are, that we are not force them to return back to go to the home country. It means that we not allow them to stay, but we also not force them to go back. It's kind of a bit not easy this situation for those people. If they got arrested, okay, maybe for sure that's they're not allowed to release from the detention. But if they release, they have to submit the bail application, pay for the bail money, and they can leave. But because it's quite limited resource for them to seeking for any kind of assistance. Yeah.
Oh, I see. So, yeah, the situation is tricky. Yeah, yeah. And one of question that I really want to ask is, what do you think is the most pressing issue challenge in Thailand for a refugee governance? If we want to having the first and the foremost issue to tackle, what is this?
I think the thing that would be I think is urban refugees kind of, I think, new issue for the Thai people and even for the governments. Be familiar with camp refugee and know who we are. But if we talking about urban refugee, it's kind of very new even for the central governments and the local governments. They don't know, and they don't know how urban refugee different from migrants people, because for Thai we have the MOU for migrants for 3 neighboring countries to come to work, which from Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, right? That's sometimes people thought that urban refugees are migrant, but actually it's not. They have a totally different condition who are traveling in Thailand. And when people don't know the definitions of the urban refugee and the reasons why those of them come to Thailand, and it will impact to another understanding. For example, people don't understand why they cannot access to work because they don't have a right to work, and how they can stay in Thailand. People don't know, because if the people cannot work, it means that they cannot gain any income, and how they can live their life in Bangkok. That is very new. And if people don't know who they are, and we not realize that they are existing in the society, it means that we are not any room to create any kind of protection for them. I think in general, people, we might not do anything much, but for the government agency that supposed to recognize and to find the way that how Thailand can provide any kind of basic protection and respond them as a human being, not just a illegal migrants. Yeah.
Okay, I want to ask the same question to Ying. Why? Thank you so much. This is so informative. Ying, what is the most pressing issue in the Urban Refugee Governance in Malaysia?
Yeah, I think if we're looking at it from the perspective of sort of like the refugees, definitely I think status, the right to stay and legal status is one of the most important things, because without sort of recognition, without any form of status, something as basic as being able to move around, you can't do that because you're subjected to arrest and detention. You cannot work. You are unable to access anything. And so I definitely think that the main thing is to kind of address the issue of legal status or having any form of documentation. I do think that from a sort of in terms of a pressing issue as a whole, right, and really building on what Moi was saying, is the fact that especially with the whole sort of COVID situation, we've seen an increase in sort of xenophobia and hate speech.
Oh, okay.
And I think that there is this huge sort of gap in terms of understanding of who refugees are. And I think that the public needs to be more aware about refugees. There needs to be a lot of sort of education and also sort of correcting of, I think, misunderstandings about sort of refugees, why they're here, and the fact that they're in need of protection. So I do think that that's something that needs to be addressed quite urgently, because I think that sometimes we think that it's just kind of like speech, but it's almost it's translating into real life experiences.
Yes.
Right? We are hearing about people being discriminated openly. They are being made homeless. They are being targeted and attacked. And I do think that that's something that needs to be addressed, I think, as well.
About the you mentioned before that the government support to refugees is very limited, almost none. But how about the states government, like that's the federal government of Malaysia? How about the states government? What is what can they do actually to refugees, urban refugees in their territories?
So I think the thing about Malaysia is that we are in terms of management of refugees and governance of refugees, it's actually very federal government based. So state governments have very little space to kind of sort of navigate or to sort of deviate beyond what the federal government has stated, right? And so but there are sort of little gaps that we've seen. So and these were things that sort of came out during the COVID situation. So for example, the federal state actually sort of was issuing sort of statements about local housing, and they were saying that it shouldn't be rented out to non-Malaysians. And because of that, that it sort of led to, among a few other reasons, the eviction of refugees from places that they were renting. But what we've seen is that because it was only sort of within that federal territory, so there were some other states that just simply didn't sort of follow that trend. And so in some ways we saw a sort of a slight sort of deviation between the state and the federal. Then another example was so in one of the states they actually mentioned that so there's a sort of regulation within the state legislation that talks about employment within certain sectors that's only supposed to be limited to Malaysians, and so they've enforced it. So I think these are things that are there, I think, but it's just that now suddenly with COVID, we're seeing enforcement of it. But then at least we're seeing sort of differences in implementation within different states. So in that sense, that's about as much. So to the extent that it is within the state authority, which is not a lot, there is some sort of slight deviation, but by and large, it is the federal government that makes, that, we follow all the sort of, so it's the federal government that ultimately has the decision around, has the power around refugee governance. Yeah.
So if there are some deviations from the states, meaning that actually changes can be made from the states to from the state level to have a bigger role in refugee protection. Deviation meaning that they don't really follow the federal regulation in that case. So there's a possibility that they will be able to move to a bigger role or to have a bigger role. Do you think it's possible to push the state's government to have a bigger role on urban refugees management?
I think it's something that we've definitely been thinking about and wanting to explore. But I think that the limit is that ultimately, it's a federal act that's saying that they are not recognized, right? That they are quote unquote illegal immigrants. And so within the state, there isn't so much that they can do. So even within a state context, right, it's still ultimately, for example, if it's something that's related to the status, they will still have to follow that. But I think the difference is in sort of like implementation. So for example, states have, some sort of level of control over, their sort of state local housing, and like regulations, and whether or not the extent that they want to implement certain things or not. So to that extent, I think there is some room to sort of like try to advocate on a state level. But I think the biggest stumbling block is the fact that, the status, I think you can't run away from that. And so, all they have to do is just say, look, we can't talk about refugees. At the end of the day, it's about status. And then, then you're sort of in some ways stuck. You can't really go beyond the state level.
Oh, I see. So it's about the legal status as the biggest, the most pressing issue, yeah? Okay, I think we should bombard the two of you with a note of my own questions. We should move to questions from participants. I will check our question and answer. Oh, there are quite many. Okay, I will start with the most voted questions. This is from Han Nguyen. Question for Hu Ying Tham from Han Nguyen. Mixed Migration Center, Danish Refugee Council. Ad hoc policies in Malaysia are largely dependent on refugees' country of origin or ethnic group. In the past, we see that refugees from the Philippines, Cambodia, Bosnia, Indonesia were provided the option of residence, but it has not been the case for Rohingya in Myanmar. In your opinion, what is the main reason for this different treatment of Rohingya compared to other refugee groups?
So just to clarify why the change in policy. So in the past, some of them have had the right to stay, whereas here for the Rohingyas, there isn't a right to stay. Is that correct?
Yeah, it said that refugee country of origins and ethnic group really define how the treatment those refugees will receive from the government. So,
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can't really speak to what like the government sort of, because it is an ad hoc policy. So I think in the past there have been certain reasons why they've decided to grant certain groups the right to stay compared to like here. But I think that the situation, I think the sort of the refugee situation is actually vastly different. So we're talking about like the last few refugees who had like the options to stay. So the ones that you've mentioned were sort of in the 90s. And I think that the situation is quite different right now. We're looking at like much higher numbers. And I think that from the sort of government's perspective is that like, we are allowing refugees to stay here on a humanitarian basis. And so they're probably reluctant to grant any more rights beyond what they feel like is appropriate given the situation. So I think that it's probably like, I mean, if you were to ask of my opinion, it would probably be that, it's just that the numbers that we're looking at are probably like quite different. And I think that the entire refugee sort of situation and response has changed drastically from the past.
Okay.
And so that's probably mine.
Okay. So yeah, things are changing, and sometimes we don't keep up with the reference. Yeah. Okay. So we moved to second questions. This is voted by 3 participants. This is for Muay. How is the involvement of local government in addressing the refugee issue in Thailand? Does Thailand have sort of best practices from any city, mayor, local government in handling refugees? This is very urban refugees.
I think to answer, I think before I step up to talking about the involvement from the local governments, I can say that since start that we are trying to advocate this issue to the central government first, because maybe the situation and the urban refugee, mostly they are living in Bangkok, and the policies maker that's mostly in the central government, that we try to advocate and ensure that the central government have a clear understanding and understand that what is the kind of appropriate protection as a Thai country, the country can provide. And that's if we succeed, I think we can have of success that we have a regular session, regular meeting with the governments, many agencies that we try together with coalitions on the refugee rights and stateless people that we call CISP, that host also working with one of the member of CISP that we do together to advocate to the central government as a national level. But for the local government level, as a host, we do have the client in many areas in Bangkok and also that the Greater Bangkok area. But we slightly try to make a connection with the local government. But to be honest, I can say it's not very easy because it's very new issue, and because in the past the local government were thought that those of them are migrant people, so we have to correct and re-understand to make sure that they understand and come to work with them. It's not easily, but I can say this under process that we are try to make sure that increase the engagement from the local government, not just host international, and also together with other CSP member that we try to work in different area that we have the clients with. But and also we recently, I cannot say that we do have a best practice at this moment, but we are in the state of the collect information in each community that we are working with, and we plan to make a report and tangible example to show to the government that people, urban refugee people, especially who are released from the detention, can live peacefully together with Thai community, and we do collect those data and make the report kind of evidence based to show the government and more recognize that's how Thai community ready to that's live, prepare and work with the refugee people, and to show that it's encourage to the government to see how good for them to collaborate and work with the CSO network to respond on this issue. Yeah.
Okay. So actually, is there any good example that the people in Thailand accept the refugee living among them? Like,
I can give the one example from the community that host working with closely, that majority of our clients that they are Vietnamese, that Montagnard ethnic group from Vietnam, that most of our clients, they live in Nonthaburi province. That is kind of not central Bangkok, is kind of suburb area. So the context of community is kind of not like in Bangkok. They still have the context of community that's local people live together, and not just the business city. So it's easily for and in the past, before the arrest, they used to live there, and people know that this group of people are existing in the community. But once they released from the detention since last year, and we come to work as a case manager to run a community-based case manager. So we have to deal with many stakeholders in the local government, in the local community, such as that we have to deal with the landlord to hiring the room, the rental room for them to stay, and contact with the local school to ensure that children can access to school, and try to communicate with many local facility, engage to the informal center, and engage with the church, that most of them are Christian and they have to go to the church, that ensure that they have some support from the local community. But it will take time for people to understand, because sometimes that we have to think, we have to be careful we don't create any conflict or misunderstanding with the local people, for Thai people also, because otherwise we might make those urban refugees are like put in at risk situation. That what we are slightly to work with them and communicate with local people in the community and also local government in that province regularly. Yeah.
Okay, so there is a good example, yeah. Maybe I have to move to Ying for one more question before we enter the second session. Ying, can you explain more about the pilot project for Rohingya refugees you mentioned before? How many participants of Rohingya refugees? How does the government decide which refugees group eligible for the project or not? How long does the pilot project occur? Wow.
A lot of questions wrapped in one.
Questions
wrapped in one. Maybe I'll just sort of start off by just saying that there isn't actually a lot of publicly available information about the pilot project, except that because this is something that was government initiated. The idea, I think, at the beginning was for 300 people, 300 Rohingyas. And if my understanding is correct, it's supposed to be on a signing up basis. So in terms of like the actual numbers, I can't quite remember. So the plantation sector wasn't the pilot project for the plantation sector wasn't great. I feel for a variety of reasons. Basically, sort of, there's a lack of understanding about the Rohingya population, like sort of what their skills were, and having them to move to like a plantation. So among other reasons. And then for the manufacturing sector, I think it's a little bit, I think it picked up a little bit better, and I think that's still ongoing. So I don't think that that's the time frame. That's my understanding. So this was around 2017, and it's still, my understanding is that the manufacturing sector is still ongoing. So that's about as much as I know, unfortunately. Hope that answered part of the question.
That's a very specific data. Of course, if you want to answer the specific data, you have to open something. Of course. Yeah. Maybe just for a homework for I don't know, another time. Okay, this is a very good fascinating talk. Actually, we still have one more question, and then I will close the first session to move to second session. This question is about this is from Y probably, yeah. How do you think the perception of local community in Thailand towards refugees? Already answered this question. Actually, based on your observation or experience, is there any grassroots movements to raise public awareness on refugee issues? Grassroots movements to raise awareness.
I think for grassroots movements to raise awareness, I think in that current situation, we not yet go to that state yet, because for the grassroots, if the participant mean by the grassroots, that means urban refugee themselves to do advocates, that we not yet that state. But we think that in the future it could be for them to raise awareness by themselves. But at this moment, regarding to their situations in Thailand, is not yet stable, and we don't when we work with them, we not focus for them to to have any kind of big movements and to raise awareness by themselves, because it might put them at risk and to be spotted by the governments because of even we do have a national screening mechanism, NSM regulations, or we do have the MOU on ATD. Somehow the government still have a big concern on national security. So before we would like to encourage refugee people or work with them, we have to think it more carefully to make sure that's our work, that's not spot to the government to see these people more as that's more as an enemy or against national security. A lot that we have to do, but we still thought in the future maybe they might do some social movements to advocate on their right. But the way we and would like to do, because we luckily that yesterday we just have some session to discuss about this with the network, so I can answer that. What we think about, we try to collect the, we are going to, as a CSP network, we are going to do the M&E session to collect the information from the groundwork that the organization who are member of CSP doing, and collect information. And one target people that we would like to collect, that we have to collect the recommendation from the refugee themselves, that what they need, what they would like to, any kind of support or protection that they would like to see from Thailand, that we can collect. And as a networking, we can start to advocate and bring that result to show to the governments by, like, together with CSP, rather than ask the refugees to raise their voice directly to the government, because we avoid them to might have some misunderstood and against to, like, don't want to spot in national security for the government, but we do encourage. But in terms of encourage the grassroots to do advocate, we do start to develop the session to work with the people by provide the training sessions about the, encourage them to know about what is their rights, and that the thing we are, as a CSP, we do together. And I think for this part, that's as a host international, we also do many kind of trainings and ensure that they understand on their right, even they are refugee, what kind of right they can practice in Thailand. And we do this kind of session together with Asylum Access Thailand a lot in last year. Yep.
Oh, okay. Wow, that's a very different situation with Indonesia. Okay, thank you, Ying and Muay, for the first session. I would like to ask you to wait. I will talk with Zico and Bu Antje. I'll give it to you after discussion with the next speaker. Okay, before starting the second session, I'd like to remind all of the participants here, if you have questions or comments for the speakers, you can use the Q&A column to type your questions or opinions for participants at YouTube. Please type it at the chat. We will help you to move it to Zoom. And then I will refer it to a question. You'll refer your questions to the speakers for response. For participant who need translation, you know what to do. There's interpretation column there. Choose the Korean. Okay, I'd like to introduce our next speakers for today. Our speaker, the number 3, Ziko Pestalozzi from SUAKA, Indonesian Civil Society Network for Refugee Rights Protection. Zico joined SUAKA at 2013 together with other volunteer legal advisors and pro bono lawyers. He provides legal aid services for asylum seekers and refugees in Indonesia, especially in Jakarta. Besides providing consultation and other legal matters, Zico is involved in advocacy of refugee rights protection, and he co-authored 2 publications, as you can see in your screen. Yeah. He graduated from Trisakti University in Indonesia, specializing in international law. And the last speaker for this afternoon is Dr. Antje Missbach. Bu Antje is a senior research fellow at the Arnold Bergstresser Institute at Freiburg University, Germany. She's the author of Troubled Transit, Asylum Seekers Stuck in Indonesia, 2016, and Indonesia, State and Society in Transition, 2019, together with Gemma Perde and Dave Gray. Okay. Hello, Bu Antje and Zico.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good morning in Germany. Yeah?
Hello, Nino.
Hello. So glad to have you with us this afternoon, and thank you for waiting. I want to ask our session with question for Zico. Yeah, We have heard about urban refugee problems in Indonesia from many presenters in the previous 5 pop-up discussion. So I will not raise the issue that has been addressed before. I will ask different question here. Yeah, Zico is also always with us, yeah, for the previous 5 sessions. Okay, Zico, after following our pop-up discussion series, in your opinion, what is the #1 issue to tackle regarding urban refugee governance in Indonesia? In Malaysia, we know that it's legal status, and also same with the Thailand. What about Indonesia? What is the #1 issue to tackle for refugee governance in Indonesia?
Okay, thank you, Mbak Nino, for the questions. I think the most pressing issue right now in terms of Indonesia context is the regulation itself. Because even though we already have the Perpres, the presidential regulation, but as you know, I think Bu Antje also can comment on this, it's still lack of provisions. I mean, if you take a look at the presidential regulation, it's merely what we call like a standard operational procedure. It's only covers what to do when we found refugees and how to register them and how to put them into shelters, and in the end, what is the supervision that we provide to quote unquote protect the refugees. But we can see that the regulation itself still, we cannot see the provision about how to access education, for example, how to access public healthcare system, or how if refugee wants to do a livelihood activities, there's still no provision about that. And I think that's the main or what we call like the root cause of the problem of the refugee governance. And I think it's worth to highlight also that the presidential regulation only heavily regulate on the refugee that what you call come to Indonesia, arrive in Indonesia through like illegal means. But for the refugees or asylum seeker who comes with legal means, with passport, with visas, and then they seek asylum in Indonesia, it doesn't cover that part. So that the presidential regulation also does not regulate about the independent living refugees. We talk about, with the Thailand and Malaysia context, we talk about the urban refugees. And I think in terms of Indonesia, all of the refugee living in the urban areas, but not all the refugee living in the urban areas are in the system. The system means they receive supports from the organization or the the supervision under the immigration. So, for example, in Jakarta, most of the refugees are living independently, which means they don't living under the IOM accommodation. They have to survive with their own. They have to seek shelter by themselves. They have to seek support for their daily needs by themselves. So that certain parts of the refugee population are still being neglected by the presidential regulation. So I think to shortly answer your question, I think the regulation is the main cause of the problem of the refugee governance in Indonesia.
So what kind of problem? Like the regulation, I know that I understand that it talk only, or in the sense that it's refugee coming by boats and floating in the sea, and the government will save them, and it doesn't correspond then with the factual situation of refugees, how they come to Indonesia, right? So what is the fundamental to change from the regulation, from the current regulations? What do you think that have to change first?
Yeah, I think in my perspective, the perspective of the government itself has to be changed first, because the perspective. I think the approach that the presidential regulation, I mean, if we talk about the historical preparation of the Perpres itself, the context is emergency situation, right?
Yes.
So whenever we found a boat, like you said earlier, a boat of Rohingya people, Rohingya refugees, or the immigration or the search and rescue intercept a boat that are coming to Australia, that's the concept of the presidential regulation. So they still not consider what to do when the refugee have to live in Indonesia without a certain timeline, for example. They are living in a sustained displacement. We cannot think that they are going to live in Indonesia 2 or 3 years. After that, they're going to get a resettlement to Canada, to Australia, to United States, where the reality right now is the resettlement quota or the resettlement opportunities is very, very decreasing. And I think the sooner the Indonesian government accepted that reality, I think then they would realize that, okay, this presidential regulation or any legal framework that Indonesia have on the refugee protection is not enough to accommodate the current reality, or even in the next future is not going to sufficient to accommodate the needs.
So if changing the regulations in the national level takes time and also takes so many political process.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestion, probably idea about urging the local governments, like what can they do, like in the meantime, while we are waiting for the national regulations to come and have more coordinated refugee governance in Indonesia? What do you think that the local government can do in the meantime?
I think when we are talking about the local government in provincial level or in municipal level, I think we have to understand that they're also having this kind of dilemma of wants to apply the appropriate humanitarian efforts to the refugees, or to apply the local context that they think that, oh, this can help the refugees. But I think what Moy says that with Ying said, the local government still think that the refugee is a central government issue. So they are reluctant, or even they are afraid to make an innovation or to make an initiative. What we can do for the population of refugee, for example, in Medan or in Makassar. So I think that's one of the reasons that hinders the innovation and the initiative of the local government. And I think the second, it is already started. I think the efforts for the local government feeling empowered to make their own initiative in innovation, but again, the regulation is restricting them. I mean, the Perpres, for example, does not give the local government the legal basis. And to talk more on technical issue, they don't give like budgetary mandates to do anything or any kind of activities that they can do in their area. So I think that's the two problem for my take.
Yeah, even though the presidential regulation, presidential decree mandates local government as the spearheads of refugee management in Indonesia, but the official or the technical guidelines.
The technical guidelines is still lacking.
Okay. So thank you, Zico, for your pleasant explanation. I'm now moving to Bu Antje. Bu Antje, I've read several papers that you publish, but I want to raise the idea of transitory context in discussing urban refugees in Indonesia and also in Thailand and Malaysia. I'd like to know your perspective actually on the transit frame in urban refugee management. Do you think the transitory context of urban refugees in Southeast Asia is still relevant, or we should start to think about alternative of this frame in seeing the urban refugees management?
Thank you, Nino, for this question. It's really good because I guess I'm guilty too, because I use this terminology transit quite frequently. But I think it's important to keep in mind that this is not a very precise analytical term. It's often more a metaphor, an idea that somebody is arriving with the intention of leaving, and there's this kind of wishful thinking that the period in between is going to be relatively short. But what is relatively short? I think there's no precise definition. Like for some person, relatively short could be a week. Another person might find a year tolerable. But as Zico already has mentioned, it's time for a reality check because the conditions have changed. Maybe not so much the internal conditions in Indonesia. There's a lot of stability. I mean, on the one hand, of course, we have the presidential decree. This was a big novelty, and it was very important that there was finally a step forward. But what has changed are very much the external factors that determine how the asylum seeker movements and also the stalemate in these movements, the stasis, are impacting on Indonesia and of course also Malaysia and Thailand. And there are several factors that are really crucial. And here I'm talking about the push factors. So there seems to be an increase in global numbers of people who have been displaced. So more people are on the move, more people are trying to find safety and secure places. On the other hand, we have noticed that there is this kind of resettlement fatigue. This is particularly past Indonesia, we could say, was an attractive transit country because people came there and they knew that the status, determination, and maybe the entire resettlement process is going to be relatively short. So they knew, unlike other countries, let's say somewhere Eastern Africa, Indonesia was a quick ticket. And for those who were particularly impatient, there was even still the option to get on a boat. Now, this option is no longer around. Australia, in a way, we could say was relatively successful in concealing its borders. So irregular departures from Indonesia are out of question. At the same time, Australia has also decreased its annual resettlement quota. And that means that people are staying in Indonesia longer and longer and longer. And of course, we have to then ask, does this metaphor, this transit idea, does it still make sense? Or is it maybe in a way obsolete if somebody has been there for 10 years, as has also been reported in the case for Malaysia and Thailand? Maybe if you want to continue using this word transit, we should actually come up with decision. In the UNHCR dictionary, we could see that they often talk about prolonged stays, and that there the cutoff mark is 5 years. So in a way, even though people still have the intention of leaving, maybe Thailand, maybe Indonesia, the reality is that people are there to stay, and that means local, not just local, but national governments have to start thinking about the third durable solution, which is local integration. Now, until now, all three countries, I suppose, are very reluctant to think about this local integration. This is something politically not wanted. It's a hot potato, we could say. But again, it also would help to apply a bit of a realistic understanding here, like leaving people without basic rights for a long period of time will most likely create a lot of problems, not only for the people who are suffering from this kind of stalemate, but it could also have unpleasant side effects for the host societies, keeping people in this kind of ghettoish marginalized, stigmatized places in society. Maybe I stop here for now.
Yeah, so I think this is a very good take that we should, like the government, of course, they are the one with authority. We just can't say. Yeah, the government should rethinking about the term transit and also moving to see the more to the reality. Yeah. Okay. You also have conducted studies on the. So I want to move to the local government rules, because when we talk about the national government, then again it will be very complicated, more complicated, because there's a political dynamics playing, and also a lot of interest, of course. Yeah, but you have conducted also studies on the local government's roles in urban refugee management in Indonesia. What do you find as a good lesson learned and challenges from those studies for others to replicate probably?
Well, thanks for this question. Yes, indeed. Together with some colleagues from UGM in Jakarta, we have looked at a number of places. We wanted to study more cities in Indonesia, but we didn't have the time. So our main focus was actually directed at Makassar and to a smaller extent also to Medan, and of course the urban refugees in Jakarta. The reason why we chose Makassar was that for a long time we had the feeling that amongst refugees themselves, Makassar had a very good standing. So there were actually times, and here I'm talking about 4 or 5 years ago, where people would try to get to Makassar and to get registered there. And back at that time, it even meant they would sometimes readily agree to be detained for a short period of time, because then they could be transferred to shelter, alternative to detention. So Makassar had a very good reputation a few years ago, and that was in a way also very much because of the local government at the time. Makassar used to have a mayor who we could say was very open to new ideas, and he was also very inclusive to try to integrate refugees to some extent. He was open because he allowed the IOM at that time to find appropriate shelters where people could live, so not behind bars, and move readily. And he was also very open in terms of like allowing this kind of casual education, people participating in events. And the reason is that he was driving this agenda of smart city, and he had a different understanding of belonging. So who's part of the city? Is it in his mind, this was not just citizens, like people with an Indonesian passport, but every person in this city should somehow belong to this city, because this feeling of belonging was seen as a positive drive to increase or improve communal life for everybody. So he was okay in a way if refugees wanted to play in soccer teams. He sometimes reached out for these communal acts where refugees and local people would clean or would maybe do some decoration in the city, some wall paintings and so on and so on. And yes, some critics have said this was mostly for him and his image building campaign because he was looking at re-election, but still, I think it was also creating a positive spin. And at least some refugees appreciated this at the time. We could see in the way they voted with their feet, people wanted to go to Makassar. But now things have changed, there's a new government in place. And in fact, some of those shelters, when we visited them the last time, which was last year, somehow started looking more and more like detention centers. So we were a little bit puzzled by this development, because first we thought like, well, maybe Makassar is even something like a sanctuary city, which is a term from refugee studies that describe a very specific welcoming culture at the local level. So not the national, but the local level, where basically the local government takes things or matters into their own hands in order to provide protection. But having gone back to Makassar last year, we, in a way, were negatively surprised that I think the general freedom and the general possibility of engagement had declined. So people suddenly had to face a curfew again. there were stricter enforcement of certain rules in the shelters. So some of these previously gained freedom had already been lost. So in a way, yes, Makassar was a good place for experimenting and creating a good scenario, but it was not durable. It was not lasting for a very long time because, as also Zico has already mentioned, budget is of course a very big problem. If there is not a specially allocated amount of money set aside from the national government, then local governments are forced to tap into their own finances. Now, this is really difficult because the budget is decided, of course, by the local parliament. So since refugees are not allowed to vote and don't have any political participation, there's not going to be many people who will vote for setting aside finances from the local budget on refugee issues. So what they have done in some localities is that they tapped into this budgetary item of emergency funding. So emergency funding is usually for flooding or maybe tsunami or some volcano eruption, like some of the natural disaster. So sometimes they use a little bit of that money, but of course this is very dangerous to take money away from this budgetary item, because if it is suddenly needed and the money has been finished in advance, there's going to be a lot of protest from the local population. And particularly in times like this in 2020, where we have like a global pandemic, refugee money shouldn't be coming out from the emergency budget. So there should be a separate category planned in advance to set aside money which can be used for social activities, health provision, or whatever. And here I must say I very much agree, of course, with Zico, who has said it requires a change of mind. As long as refugee affairs are viewed as an emergency and only in the emergency framework, we most likely will not see much progress. I think in a way, refugee affairs need to be normalized. So refugees are here, most likely they are here to stay, and we should not continue to keep treating them as like a volcano eruption or an earthquake, something that happens for a short moment and then can be maybe solved a few years later. So we need to move away from this emergency mindset and normalize the presence of refugees. So they're not natural catastrophe, but it's just something that happens all the time, all around the world. It's nothing too exceptional in a way.
Thank you. I had a electricity down for a few seconds. So sorry for my disruption from me. Okay, so this is going back to the Makassar. Lesson learned from Makassar. Political will from the local leader is one of the key, and how actually to wrap up the narration, it can be linked to global narration like smart city. So mayor feel like, oh, this is a good narration to follow. So smart city, everyone's are welcome, no one left behind, something like that. So this is actually one of the key. Do you think this is actually one of the key to have like some to trigger involvement of the local government? So sometimes the local government or local leaders, they don't want to do something because they don't see the benefit of it. Like they need to see something positive for them, something like that. Do you think that's one of the tactic or strategy to involve more local government?
I mean, definitely. I mean, most mayors, they will be inward looking. They will be looking at the electorate because they might be interested in being re-elected. But then, of course, now we have this global infrastructure. There are special awards for mayors. There's this international competition, like which city is the smartest city in the world. So there are awards. So some mayors, particularly those who maybe have studied overseas or who have friends overseas or families, they tend to be a little bit more outward looking, and they might also be watching other places of what's happening with refugees in the US-American context, or what's happening with refugees somewhere in Turkey. So I guess there is definitely potential for mayors and local politicians to learn from the international, from the global context. But then again, looking at their portfolio and the many, many tasks that they have, I guess to be realistic, there's only going to be a certain capacity or amount of time that they can use in order to advance their knowledge in this field. So that's why I probably agree very much with my 3 other panel members that it's very much to the central level, the national governments, to in a way create the overall umbrella or framework, rather than let 20 or 30 mayors or municipal leaders reinvent the wheel. So there should be a little bit more of a national guidance and framework on what's possible. But I was very surprised, like recently I participated in some online discussions with representatives from the Indonesian Foreign Ministry, and the rhetoric which we can find there is Indonesia is a transit country. So Indonesia is a transit country gets reiterated and repeated all over again. And it's interesting for me because when members of the government or representatives use this term, it's often almost like a shield to defend their unwillingness for local solutions, because as long as they can declare themselves to be transit countries, they can take their hands off from duties and obligations and responsibilities, so to say.
Yeah, as also the second language is non-signatory for countries for refugee convention and the refugee protocol. So that two narration is always being used to some sort of saying that they don't have. We don't need to take bigger responsibility. So this we've been nice enough to accept those people in our border, something like that. Okay, Bu Antje and Zico, we have many questions from our participants here. I will take one question with the most for it for you to answer. Probably this is for Zico. Yeah, from Daru Purnomo. Jika tidak ada kepastian jumlah kuota negara tujuan pengungsi, apakah pemerintah Indonesia tidak sebaiknya mulai memikirkan untuk menetapkan jumlah kuota pengungsi yang bisa ditampung di wilayah Indonesia sebagai negara transit? So, if there isn't any quota for resettlement, isn't that better for Indonesia to start thinking about having some quota for refugees to be accepted in Indonesian, like not to do accepted, like Indonesia has quota for refugees to transit in Indonesia. So this is the questions, more or less, yeah? Okay.
Do I answer it directly or?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you for the questions. I think I have to answer this in with the legal perspective. I mean, short answer is Indonesia couldn't set a quota of how many refugees or how many asylum seekers that can enter or arrive in Indonesia at a certain time. I mean, it is completely contrary with the principle of the non-refoulement, where a country cannot reject any asylum seeker that seek protection from country of asylum. Which is Indonesia is as a member of the international community has to obey that kind of legal principle. And I think the non-refoulement principle also is one of the provisions in the in the international human rights instrument that Indonesia is a party of, like the Convention Against Torture, for example. And in that sense, again, short answer, the Indonesia cannot make that kind of restriction, because it would cause a condemnation from the international community, I would say. And I think this question should be what I call should be a response by strengthening our system of the refugee governance, because first of all, we cannot reject any kind of arrival or any kind of asylum seeker that enter the Indonesia. So we have to strengthen our internal system to govern the refugees that come to Indonesia. And I think I just want to add a little bit what Bu Antje said, and it is I think a little bit in correlation with the questions. I think the stance with the Indonesian government with the Indonesia as being a transit country is try to maintain that the refugee issue is temporary. So the temporariness is the one that causing there is no needs for a legal certainty or no needs for the legal framework. So I think that's why also the government relies heavily with the international NGO like UNHCR or IOM. But in reality, I think the government also realized that the international NGO like UNHCR and IOM have their own limitation, and they cannot answer every needs that the government deflect to them. So this is your mandate about refugees, so handle it. And the Indonesia would just like steer clear of the responsibility, because Indonesia have to be, you know, understand that as a duty bearer for this issue, for the refugee issue in Indonesia. I think that's my answer.
Okay, thank you so much. So we are moving on to the next questions. This is for Bu Antje with 3 votes. To Bu Antje, since you've conducted some studies on refugee management in several ASEAN countries, in your opinion, what is the future of refugee management in the ASEAN, in which most of them are transit countries? Is there a possibility for a collaboration that can address the problem of refugees, especially the Rohingya refugees, considering that ASEAN countries still adhere to the principle of non-interference?
This is a very difficult question, and I'm often a bit skeptical. I mean, of course, it would be very desirable to have this regional approach, regional solution steered by ASEAN. But then I think 50 years ASEAN has taught us that this is a very slowly moving body. And in light of the recent emergency through the maritime arrivals and the pushbacks, I probably would not want to rely so much on ASEAN. Of course, it would be nice to have a refugee task force. Of course, it would be nice to have a regional legal framework for refugee protection. That would all be very desirable, but I'm just a bit skeptical that we might not see this. And I guess the more realistic way to move forwards is to see these changes happening at the national level. And I think for those people who are involved in lobbying, it's maybe advisable to, when they talk to their governments, to not talk about refugees as burdens, as duties and these sort of things, but to kind of point out to the potential that refugees bring as human beings, as maybe even human resources, if you want to take such a utilitarian perspective. But most of the refugees that we look at from the statistics, they're very young. So that means they are at a stage in their life where they still, it's easy to educate them. It's easy to provide them with skills. It's easy to make them valuable members of the society. It's easy even to make them taxpayers. And usually these are keywords that make government representatives to open up their ears, to pay some attention by pointing out that people are not just recipients of charities or financial support, but that they actually also have the potential to give something back to the host societies that might, hopefully could change the perspective of some of the refugee, of the local and national governments to be more open to also integrate refugees for a longer period of time. And I mean, I'm not an economic expert or so, but there are enough people who have done the mathematics and they have calculated of how long or how much does it take to give somebody the opportunity to study or to educate somebody for 3 years in a vocational school. And then assuming that this person would be paying tax for the next 30 years, I mean, there is still a lot of benefit to be gained for national government. So I guess these could be some useful exercises for lobbyists in the 3 ASEAN countries that we are talking about today, to see what are the benefits. And of course, we should not just limit our perspectives on economic issues. There's so much more that can be gained from refugees. I myself always enjoyed the cooking skills in Jakarta. Whenever you're a little bit bored of nasi goreng, you can now have a kebab made by an Afghan refugee. So that's a great enrichment, culinary enrichment, and there are many other examples we could probably quote here.
Okay, but if we talk about benefit, like how, for example, they will pay tax, first they have to be able to work, right? They have to have these rights to work. This is something that's very lacking. That's one of the basis of the lack of refugee management in these 3 ASEAN countries, that there's no rights to work for refugees. So before talking about the benefit, economic benefit from those refugees communities, we should let them work first and then let them pay tax, something like this. So yeah.
Yes, of course, this is a precondition. So if the government wants to earn tax, they have to give rights, and that would be, of course, the right to work. Indonesia is very much afraid that refugees might be stealing jobs, or this is the usual common rhetoric, because there's a surplus of Indonesian labor. Indonesia has always been a labor exporting country. There's a large number of unemployed people in Indonesia, and that has become aggravated during the times of Corona. However, a lot of refugees bring in a different set of skills. So they might not necessarily be competing with people in the informal sector. They might be able to find niches for themselves without taking away job opportunities from Indonesians. So again, this is probably would be a wonderful task for a PhD student to study in more detail. So.
That's one of the opportunity for study.
Nino?
Okay.
Can I add just a little bit about what?
Not a little bit, okay.
No, I just really interested in what Bu Antje said. I mean, there has been a discussion. I mean, I understand what Bu Antje skeptical stance coming from, but yeah, I mean. I think in this year alone, I think there's been a discussion about the ASEAN to form a special refugee protection bodies. I mean, I think the chair of Indonesia, representative of Indonesia, Mbak Yuyun, already encouraged that the ASEAN to immediately establish a special refugee protection bodies, because I think it can be one of the approach to let the countries within ASEAN, instead of pointing fingers, oh, the Malaysia won't receive the Rohingya, or the Thailand wouldn't receive the Rohingya. That's why the Rohingya keep coming to Indonesia. So that kind of pointing finger behavior is I think very counterproductive in terms of the refugee governance in ASEAN. So in ideal thinking, in ideal perspective, I think the refugee protection bodies would help the what you call the regional cooperation instead of regional, pointing fingers activities. So, but again, yeah, it is in ideal situation, but I understand that even ASEAN with the non-interference principle, it's kind of counterproductive. But I think if we can give this a shot, I don't know, it might work or not, but I think it's a very good idea to at least because Indonesia by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs always raising the rhetoric of burden sharing responsibilities. So I think this kind of bodies would provide a specific mechanism of what is burden sharing, what is sharing responsibility, at least between the ASEAN countries. Yeah.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I'm not against people trying this. I'm very much in favor, and of course, Ayun has done a great job. She's very vocal and very present on this. But then again, I think there's probably going to be a parallel approach. So we have the midterm, the long term, and then I guess at the moment we also need a lot of short term, because I mean, even just yesterday there were new reports about Rohingya being stranded and being sighted close to Aceh. So I don't think that these people who are still on the boats and that are still coming have the time to wait until ASEAN has figured out what to do. I guess for them there needs to be a faster search and rescue mechanism to bring them on land and to prevent them from dying at sea.
We move to next question. This is still for Bu Antje. This is from YouTube. So our officer helped to move question from YouTube to Zoom. Bu Antje Missbach, how to wake the government, particularly central government, up to see the urgency of refugee issue, for we know that it is not their priority. So how to jog the government?
Well, I always feel a bit unpleasant answering these questions because I'm not an Indonesian, and it's really not my task to tell the Indonesian government what to do. I think if anybody, it has to be Indonesian students or Indonesian academics to do this job. Like otherwise, it's the bule, the white person giving out advice. That's usually not appreciated and rather counterproductive. And it's also dangerous because I think for the Indonesian government, it's quite easy to reject any sort of like comments or advice given by people who are from countries that are very hostile to refugees themselves. So again, I think this is a task for Indonesians, for Thai people, for Malaysian people to do. But again, as I tried to explain before, it is about like the normalization of refugees. Refugee movements, they will be with us for all our lives, I suppose. Not always coming from the same countries, but then again, nobody is secure of not becoming a refugee himself at some point. It's always good to keep in mind, we have seen people fleeing from Indonesia to Malaysia, or people from Indonesia coming to Europe. So there's always a possibility that something might cause the individual to leave, and therefore it is good to start to think about reinstalling these reciprocal measures. What about if I need to flee for my life? How would I like to be treated by another country? So that's one way. But then of course also by normalizing refugees and by trying to see the positive impacts they can bring, it might be one possibility. And again, just maybe bringing a little example here from Germany is that Germany is a society with a very old population. So even those people who are very xenophobe, they have to acknowledge that we do need young people. And the refugees from Syria, they tend to be young. So again, we might come back to having to build visions of our societies in the future, and who's going to be paying tax in the future.
So it can be moved back to that argument that this is benefiting for the country and also the society. That's one of the arguments that have to be put forward there.
I think this might help, but also Indonesia always wants to be a champion and a pioneer for democratization within ASEAN. So again, it's a wonderful opportunity to maybe take up a pioneering role and see whether other countries might join. It always needs some country that is a little braver than the rest, maybe, to do the first step, and maybe others will follow. And I guess Indonesia, within its foreign policy, definitely has the idea of being a champion for democratization. And I think that also involves the treatment of international refugees.
I see. That's one of the good idea. Okay, this is very interesting discussion, and I would like to move to this next session. I would like to invite Muay and Ying back to us, so we can have more livelier discussion. Muay and Ying, can you turn on the video? Okay, you already turned on the video. So, welcome back. So we'll be responding to questions and comments, but before that, of course, I have my own questions. I would like to ask this question to Muay, Ying, and Zico. From the listening to Indonesian and also Malaysian and Thailand cases, and also listening to Bu Antje, what is the similarity of refugee governance in the 3 countries that you can relate? Maybe what is the, this is the same thing. Maybe I give the opportunity to Ying first.
It's a bit difficult to pinpoint one thing. I do think there's just so many similarities. Like as Antje and Zico were talking, I was just like nodding. As Moy was talking, I was nodding. I think in terms of like the barriers that we see, certainly, I think the whole issue around the lack of a legal framework, and policy. I think like the arguments. So I remember Antje sort of mentioning about how how people were talking about like the right to work, and one of the barriers was like stealing jobs, and we hear the exact same arguments, the exact same things. So I think I would sort of maybe stop there, because otherwise I'll take up too much time. But really, I think that they're just so similar in terms of the responses, and in terms of, I think, just the lack of that legal framework and the problems that arise from that lack of legal framework.
How about you, Moy? Do you have the same opinion, or you have diverse opinion about?
Yeah, I think the same that we said that about the legal framework, that is not clear enough, and that is not clear enough will bring to the government don't know how to provide appropriate protection for those people. And this recently it seems to be that our ASEAN countries, the process that's most of implementation that's under the UNHCR responsibility, and then governments more recognize what UNHCR are doing. But just like the process, but even we do have UNHCR office and run many RSC process in each country, but somehow it's not the status of the refugee not recognized enough. Yeah. And I think it's same thing. I'm not sure the same or similar. I think it seems to be the understandings of the governments still like understanding still in the central part, but not spread around the nations wide.
Oh, okay. So the discourse between in the public is still lack.
Yeah.
Okay. How about you, Zico? Zico already mentioned so many things, like raising so many ideas. But Zico, what do you think that you can relate from Moy and also from Ying?
I think the similarities between the government between Malaysia or Thailand, even Indonesia, is still the government still persistence to use the security approach in the refugee governance. I mean, in a way, the security approach, the national security approach, extended to this kind of paranoia that the refugee will disrupt the countries, the refugee will cause problems in many aspects of the countries. And I think what Bu Antje said, that kind of perspective, I think there are a lot of research right now, article written, journal written, and I think that the percentage that the government, that the refugees are going to cause the problem is because the lack of the governance from the government itself, not because of the refugees. So if the government like to don't even invest to make a good governance in terms of the refugee handling in a country, that, well, I wouldn't blame the government, but I think that they invite the problem by itself because of not doing the necessary things that would prevent that kind of problem. I think that's my take.
If the central government is lack of regulation is one of the problems, and we understand that changing the regulation in national level is very, very difficult. So many political dynamics, and also needs a lot of effort and time. what can we do then? We cannot just waiting and waiting something to happen, miracle to happen, but we have to do something. What do you think we have to do? No, maybe, yeah. Muay can answer this, Ying or Zico, or maybe Antje. What is your idea? Do you have any idea about what should we do? We cannot just waiting for miracle for the regulation from the central government, of course.
Yeah, I can say that I think the thing, but what we can do, I think I can give the example that what we are working here as a networking. I think that's we try to work with we not, I think at the same time that why we are waiting the government to take appropriate actions. At the same time, we also, as a CSO network, we try to work alongside with the government that try to make a collaborations and communicate with the government and kind of offer our assistance. That's okay. Because I think to reflect that what's the gap that we found from the ground and present, communicate with the government that how as a CSO network can support to the government work to ensure that we have some in the country have some appropriate protection system and not work together with the government, not being separate, or that's against the government, and somehow we work with the government. We do understand that what's the domestic legal framework and its limitations, but we try to not use them as our message to against that how we would like to against the government, but we try to do another way around that what we can do. That's, for example, that as a CSO we have a lot of flexibility. We do have a budget or the manpower to implement something. That's mostly the government cannot do. Yeah.
Do you have something to add to this idea about what can we do in the meantime until something happen in the central government?
Yeah, so I think that there are a few things that we can do and that we should do, because I think that, I mean, ultimately, of course, we need the government to be able to pass a policy,
yes.
But it doesn't happen in a vacuum, and I think that we need to be able to create that kind of political will. And there are, of course, many ways that we can think about it, right? So, I mean, policy advocacy is one way to kind of put in the pressure, but the other thing is also to look at how do we engage with the broader public, because at the end of the day, the government is responsive to their constituents, right?
Yes.
And so we need to think about, okay, how do we create that political will? How do we kind of address the public and the public's kind of concerns, and how do we deal with that? At the same time, one of the things that we think about at Asylum Access is community empowerment. So how do we kind of move from that framework? And I thought Antje brought it up so well, where she was talking about we can't think about just emergency. We can't think about it as just kind of immediate needs. But what's the long-term thing? How can we prepare them for this sort of for the long-term stay in Malaysia? So, and empowering them through sort of legal empowerment, letting them know what their rights are, how to navigate the space while they're in it, and us trying to expand the protection spaces in Malaysia. So for example, one area that we've kind of looked at is, in labor protection. So we're okay, lessons learned from sort of the people that have been working on migrant rights, right? Is this something that we can also kind of expand the protection space for refugees? So really thinking about expanding protection spaces, I think using the time to create the political will, while also doing the sort of policy advocacy directly with the government. I think it's like a combination to really get where we want to be.
For Zico, do you think in Indonesia case, because I'm Indonesian, policy advocacy, who do you think can be the leading, not the leading sector, I'm not talking about the lead, but how can we actually have a strategic policy advocacy in Indonesia? I'm Indonesian, of course, and Zico is Indonesia. So I'm talking about the very specific. So how can we have this policy advocacy, as Hu Ying mentioned, to have a change in the regulation in the national government?
I think for the advocacy policy advocacy, I think we have to do it together. I mean, together means that it cannot be just through UNHCR, just through IOM, but also the CSO, the local NGO have to take parts. And referring to your first question, Nino, I think in Indonesia context, the NGO and the CSO, even the refugee itself, have the luxury to initiate many programs or many initiatives in a small scale, in a very small scales. But that kind of activity will give what do you call the lesson learned or the best practice, and that kind of example can be fed to the government to show that, oh, this kind of activity works. This kind of activity promotes the social inclusion with the local community, for example. Oh, this kind of activity of education works for the refugee children who doesn't have any access for the formal education, for example. Oh, the activity for training like SUAKA did, training the refugee to be paralegal, to understand more about their rights while living in the transit countries, is increasing the knowledge of refugees that what is their duty and their law obligation while living in Indonesia. I think that kind of small scale activities, we have the luxury to do it. And understand that the government cannot do that kind of activity because of their budget, for instance, or even it's not in correlation with the government program. But I think the local NGO, the grassroots movement can start with that, and then can be fed to the government in form of policy brief, maybe, or to with the campaign. And I think it's worth to try. And I think I understand Host International in Thailand or Asylum Access in Malaysia already tried many kind of activities or many kind of initiatives to empower the refugee, to show that the refugee is not a burden to the society of the host society. I think that's my take.
I want to ask for Bu Antje now. Muay and Hu Ying and also Zico already said about civil society roles, for to have for policy advocacy and also filling the gap of the lack of government support to refugee management in those three countries. What do you think about the city and local governments? How can what is the possibility to have them? Yeah, you already mentioned about that the local government is very not durable solution, like not sustainable, like the changing of the mayors or the changes of the policy. But what is the possible role actually for the local government under limited authorities and resources, and also limited time frame, only for 5 years of one mayor periods in Indonesia, for example? What do you think about the local government? What is a breakthrough that we can attain? We cannot just waiting for like this. I mean,
Well, I mean, as has been pointed out, if we want to see change, then we have to tap into different levels, and so there needs to be a local turn. And the beauty about like the local turn and the responsibility of local governments is that they can do a lot of things in a short period of time, and they often have more freedom or more flexibility in how they want to do things, because it's small scale and they can do a lot of test cases. Again, there's of course always the risk that things go utterly wrong. But I think for individuals, it will be very important that they have good relations with local governments, that they continue lobbying city councils for participation in education, formal education, and also like for example, getting proper school certificates, not just being allowed into schools, because without certificates, they won't be able to do anything else. So all these things can be changed on a local level. It's up to a local government to allow access to schools. It's up to local governments to allow exhibitions, income generating projects, collaboration. So this can be done on the local level, and we have seen a lot of good examples. I was, for example, very impressed by the local government in Langsa, which is in Aceh, that has written a blueprint to be used for other cities, not just Indonesia, but also in ASEAN. And they tried to share their experiences. What was it like to host a large number of Rohingya in 2015, 2016? So I don't know to what extent this blueprint has been printed, but there are definitely cities that are reaching out, and in order to save time, they want to communicate city to city, mayor to mayor, NGO to NGO, and not always just through the embassies and national governments. So we do see a lot of potential for this local turn, but I'm still of the opinion to see maybe more substantial change in the future. There also needs to be a regional turn, and we have talked about some of the international stakeholders, of course, international organizations, IOM, UNHCR, ASEAN, very importantly, but one body that has not been mentioned at all today was, of course, the Bali process, which is when it comes to setting the mindset or defining the discourse or the terms that are being used, they are very, very important. Now, some NGOs have observer status. Some of the people are involved in the track 1 and track 2 background talks. And I think a lot of NGOs probably have easier access than, for example, academics. And it's, I think, really up to them to try to influence the discourse. So a lot of the international movements across borders is on the Bali process level is framed as people smuggling and trafficking in people. But that is not the whole truth. Like, for example, when we talk about the Rohingya, they are not just the victims who were naive enough to give money to traffickers who treat them horribly. But the whole truth is that they also cannot live in their home country in Myanmar because they've been forcibly displaced. And that often, these protection aspects, they're often getting a little bit lost when it comes to this regional debate. So I think it's very important that there are some critical voices when it comes to these regional forums to remind them of, like, what are we actually talking about? What terminology are we using? It's not just victims of trafficking and smuggling. It's people looking for safety, for freedom, for an end to the persecution that they are suffering from.
But if we talk about the Bali process, my take is like that process become a different negotiation table. Like countries try to leverage their interest and like negotiate and the refugees is just the context, but actually this is kind of negotiation between countries for the domestic interest or regional interest, something like that. Am I taking wrong, or because I don't really like very optimistic about the Bali process, and it's not ASEAN. It's not ASEAN.
The problem with the problem or the opportunity is that the Bali process, of course, is also co-chaired by Australia, and they are very good in pushing their national interests. And if it was up to them, they probably would get rid of certain key terms like protection altogether. But it's up to Indonesia as the co-chair to make sure that these keywords stay in and that the framework on protection actually gets expanded rather than decreased, I would say. I wanted to say another thing about lobbying and who to talk to. And one thing that I find often very interesting in the case of Indonesia is that the foreign ministry is very vocal and very much involved when it comes to the dealing of refugee affairs. But other ministries maybe less so. Hukum and Ham, of course, like the law and justice ministry is very much involved, but what about like manpower? What about other ministries? Like, why don't they have so much of a say when it comes to regulating affairs of refugees? I think it would probably help to normalize some of the ad hoc treatment that we can see now. For example, Indonesia, of course, is one of the few countries that has actually signed the Convention for the Protection of Migrant Labor. And Indonesia is very focused and driven when it comes to protecting the rights of Indonesian migrant workers. Yeah. But when it comes to the protection of, for example, work rights of refugees in Indonesia, they don't want to really hear too much about it. But I think this is a debate or a discourse that needs to be taken up to push for a bit more reciprocity, that in order to maintain credibility and by trying to improve the labor protection rights of Indonesians going overseas, then Indonesia also has to grant certain guarantees and certain rights to people coming to Indonesia. And of course, they are not coming as labor migrants, that's understood. But we also do know, in order to live a kind of dignified life, refugees sooner or later will have to work, because either there are no subsidies on a permanent basis, or B, they really want to earn their own living. So again, I think it would be good to try to connect these issues when lobbying, and also trying to involve more stakeholders on a national level, not just the usual suspects, so to say, because of course there's only so much that the foreign ministry can do when it comes to refugee affairs. As long as they are the most involved ministry, then they will always have this kind of short-term focus and this more like external looking orientation. But we do also need to involve these ministries that are more responsible for labor rights inside of Indonesia, for example.
Thank you. I still want to have several follow-up questions, but we will have to open the question and answer from the audience. I have one question for Muai. This is in Indonesia. Apa ada pengungsi perkotaan di kota lain juga Thailand selain Bangkok? Kalau iya, berapa banyak, dan apa ada yang bekerja untuk mereka juga seperti host? How many is there any refugees in other city other than Bangkok? And if so, how many are there? And it's going. How many are there? And what is there any NGOs working for them, such as like hosts, like similar like hosts?
The first question, that's how many are there that outside Bangkok? Difficult to because we never collect the information together with organizations. I can the number I can say from host sites that the client that we work with who are live outside Bangkok, around 30 families. That family unit, not if late. For individual basis, you can multiply by 4. Yeah, that is average. But just number that host working as a case manager, that actually that I think I'm sure that have more than the total number is more than our populations. And the service provider who working on urban refugee issue, that so many organizations, I can say that I can give the example, the name of the organization that host used to work with them quite closely in terms of be a part of a case management team together. That for example, Asylum Access Thailand, that provide the legal protections, and protection center for asylum protections also provide the legal protections. So that's service. And we work with Step Ahead foundations that provide service in terms of alternative care and guarantor to be guarantor for the person who are bailed out. Caritas Bangkok, they provide emergency support. JIS also, we do. JIS have also urban refugee in program in Bangkok that's provide also case management, and they have a service on case-based as cash-based assistance.
Oh.
And BSC Bangkok Refugee Center, this is also one of implementing partner of UNHCR that provide cash-based intervention program, and they do have health program and education program. Chiji Foundations also provide health. They have a free clinic for refugee. Actually, it's for anyone you can go. That's provide free clinics once a month. Yeah. And also IOM, UNHCR, yeah, and RRLP that provide also legal protection to urban refugee. Yeah, actually, it's more than that. Many organizations and so we do. That is the NGO part. Somehow that's our process, especially for the case management work. We also work closely with Department of Children and Youth that under Ministry of Social Development and Human Security. That's one part of we can call, or you can call as a multidisciplinary team that we try to ensure that our connections, our relationship, we engage each kind of specific service organizations that kind of main various enough that ensure that we can respond to each family's holistic view. Yeah.
Thank you. So many organizations work in Thailand. It's the same similar with host. Yeah. Okay. Next question. I will give it to Ying. In general, how do you assess the relation built between the UNHCR and the government? What are the cooperation and the contradiction? Maybe the conflict, the problem, the gap of expectations. Yeah, Ying, this is
such a loaded question. It's such a loaded question.
Yeah, indeed.
I can tell you from like a Malaysian perspective. So UNHCR sort of started operations in the 1970s. So it's that's when sort of the Vietnamese refugees arrived in Malaysia. And I think since then there's always been this sort of relationship of like tolerating UNHCR's presence in Malaysia. But I think it sort of goes hand in hand with the way that we view sort of the Malaysian government views refugees, right? Is that it's temporary, it's a humanitarian basis, and so UNHCR's the reason why UNHCR is here is to process them and to resettle. And I think that probably worked early on, but like obviously now with resettlement numbers going down, and UNHCR being the only body that's sort of like recognizing refugees, I think that there's always going to be like a massive tension, right? Because like the government's expectations of how long refugees should be here for and what they should, like what sort of rights should be given here. And so I think that it's one of it's one that's very diplomatic. I think it's one that's very tolerant, and I think both of them just trying to kind of come to a compromise of sorts, I think. And because like I think that for the Malaysian government, right, it's like we're talking about a UN body, and so there's only so much you can do, and I think from a UNHCR perspective as well, like their mandate is for the protection of the refugees, and so that has to be their priority, and they need to sort of manage the relationship as best as they can to ensure that they can continue doing the work they do. And I think that being the only body that's sort of recognizing refugees and providing protection for refugees, it's a very difficult position to be in.
Yeah. I can understand. Sometimes some priorities has to change, like which one comes first. Yeah, I really understand that. I can imagine. Okay, last question. This is for Zico. Questions from anonymous. Saya tertarik tentang burden sharing yang Mas Ziko sebutkan. Bagaimana prinsip burden sharing ini diterapkan dalam domestik Indonesia antara pemerintah nasional dan daerah. So it's about the burden sharing that you mentioned, Ziko, about how how can this principle of burden sharing be implemented in domestic Indonesian refugee governance, between the national and the local government? Can we follow this principle for domestic urban refugee management?
Well, this is a difficult question, actually. But yeah, I will try my best to answer it. I mean, in terms of the governments of the refugees between the central government and the regional government or the provincial government, the burden sharing, I think, can be understood like as simply as the central government give the clear guidelines on what the provincial or the lower the government what can do and what they can do, because that's kind of the main problem on the purpose, because the purpose doesn't give clear guidelines on how should the presidential regulation be implemented. I draw an example of the shelter allocation in the president's regulation. Even though in the provision, the provincial or the local government have the mandate or have the authorities to specifically allocate where the refugees should be sheltered, but there is no technical guidance provided within the president's regulation. I think it's not so much of the burden sharing, but it's much more like a management. Yeah, management. So in terms of burden, I think it's kind of misconception for the governance of refugee in Indonesia, because another example, for example, budget. So if the regional government or the local government allowed to spend monies or budget, like Bu Antje said, beyond the emergency allocation, so please give the legal framework for the legal basis. So in that way, the local government, it's more confidence to take parts of the refugees living in their areas. So in that sense, there is no blaming in the end. There's no finger pointing. Hey, I didn't say that you can do that. Oh, but it's my area. I have to do something, because you wouldn't take any responsibility of that. So that kind of dynamics that we want to prevent. And I think if that guidelines is clear, I think it would be much more efficient in terms of the governance.
Okay, thank you so much. We've been discussing for more than 2 hours. And because of time limitation, we should stop here. But I have one job to summarize our talk. It is very difficult. Wrap up. After listening to all the speakers, I think this is safe to say that the pressing issue or concerning the urban refugee government in ASEAN countries are, first, the legal status, our legal framework for refugee management. And also there is the right to work. There is a very pressing issue for asylum refugees and asylum seekers. And this problem is closely related to the transitory context in framing the refugee situation in Southeast Asia, and also minimal involvement of local government, because there is no legal framework and guidelines, and also the gap of knowledge between what is the responsibility, what we can do between the national government and the local governments. Okay, at least that's my take. This is a very difficult job, considering that urban areas are, of course, because we talk about urban refugees, considering that urban areas are home of refugees and asylum seekers. Local government must be given more support, yeah, in authority, regulation, and perhaps budget discretion, so they can have more money for service delivery for the refugees in their area. And also, they should be informed about the linkage between urban refugees and urban development, and putting in the bigger frame, so they feel like, oh, this is something that have to do because this is one of part of urban development. This is the mandate of my team, urban refugees, and link it with urban development. So the regional, of course, also that in the regional level, cooperation between the countries is still very limited and slow. And even though ASEAN Human Rights Commission started to work on refugee issue, we still have to wait, and maybe we still have to wait for some times before this will be implemented, and we can see some development on it. Okay, maybe this is also the opportunity to intensify other lines of cooperation, yeah, in regional ASEAN 1.5 or second line of diplomacy track that Bu Antje has mentioned before, to strengthening the cooperation between regional cooperation. We haven't talked about IPPRI, how to intensify that network for a greater, for a bigger, for better refugee management in Southeast Asian countries. Okay, time to close this extraordinary discussions. Before closing, I would like to say big thank you to our speakers, for Ying, Muai, Zico, Bu Antje, and also for the participants for your questions and comments. This is already your comments and question enrich our discussion, and this is time well spent. I can't thank you enough, actually. Thank you so much. So everyone, I'm Nino Viartasiwi, returning back the floor to our host, Akino. Akino, over you.
Thank you very much, Nino, for the moderation today. And also thank you very much to all speakers for the very, very interesting and engaging discussion this afternoon. So everyone, we have listened to the perspective from our international speakers about the situations that are quite different, but also quite similar in the three countries. So thank you all for your participation through Zoom and YouTube for all 2.5 hours. I hope you also enjoyed the discussion like I did, especially when the speakers talk about city-to-city network, because that's what we in RDI UREF are interested in. Also, thank you to SPF, UNHCR, IOM, friends from Immigration Office or other public offices in Indonesia and others for joining us. I would also like to give a shout out to our team and translators behind the screen for the amazing support for today. On their behalf, I would also like to apologize for any technical problems or any inconvenience today. We still have 2 more installments in this pop-up discussion series in November. We will talk about urban refugee management during pandemic era. And in the last session, we will talk about our own research last year in RDI UREF about placemaking and social integration between youth refugees and local youth in Makassar. And also, we will conclude all the discussion from the first pop-up discussion to the last session in 4 weeks from now. The last 2 discussions will be in Bahasa Indonesia, but if you don't speak Bahasa but you want to listen, please let us know in the feedback form or through our social media channels, because we may be able to provide the interpretation feature, and this time is from Bahasa to English. All right, you've seen on your screen that there is a reminder about attendance list and feedback forms. If you haven't filled out, please spare 5 minutes of your time to do so, and then after that we can issue your e-certificate. You can download the e-certificate from the link that you see on the screen, but only between those dates. So not now, but from Monday to Wednesday, yeah? We will also share responses from speakers to the questions and comments that haven't been responded to in this live discussion through our social media channels. So do follow us in any of these platforms that you see on your screen. Thank you very much for the screen. So once again, On behalf of the organizer, RDI UREF, I would like to say thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today, and see you in 2 weeks.